That's my timber." The HOA Karen's shriek echoed across the lake as she pointed at my woodpile. I was just unloading firewood at my peaceful cabin when this nightmare began. What she didn't know was what that woodpile really was. What I didn't know was how dangerous she could become when desperate. This wasn't just a neighbor dispute. This was about to become the fight of my life. And by the end, one of us would lose everything. The truth will shock you. Recoil Stories fam. Comment where you're watching from. My name is Mark Thompson, and I'm a third-generation woodworker who inherited more than just skills from my grandfather. The lakeside cabin where this whole mess started has been in our family for over 60 years. Sitting on 2 pristine acres of Minnesota shoreline that my grandfather bought back in the 1960s. Every summer since I was 8 years old, I'd spent weeks here learning the craft that would eventually become my livelihood. The smell of fresh-cut wood, the feel of grain beneath my fingers, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with my own hands. This place taught me all of that. What it didn't teach me was how to deal with a neighbor from hell. It was a Tuesday morning in early September when I backed my pickup truck down the gravel drive toward the cabin storage area. The truck bed was loaded with what looked like ordinary firewood to most people, but I knew better. I'd spent the last 2 months carefully selecting each piece from suppliers across 3 states, building toward a project I'd been planning for 7 years. These weren't logs for the fireplace. These were the foundation of something special, something that would honor both my grandfather's legacy and my own family's future. I was methodical as I unloaded each piece, checking for damage from transport, arranging them in neat stacks according to species and grain pattern. This lumber wasn't going anywhere near a fire. That's when she appeared. Victoria Hartwell had moved into the massive lakefront mansion next door just 3 months earlier, and our interactions had been limited to polite waves across the property line. She was the type of woman who drove a pristine white SUV that never seemed to have a speck of dirt on it, always dressed like she was heading to a country club board meeting. I'd heard whispers around the lake about her previous neighborhood, something about problems with other homeowners, but I'd dismissed it as local gossip. People move to lake communities for peace and quiet, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Excuse me. Her voice cut through the morning air like a buzzsaw. Excuse me. What exactly do you think you're doing? I looked up from the oak board I was examining to see Victoria marching across her perfectly manicured lawn toward my property line. Her face was already flushed red, and she was pointing at my woodpile like it had personally insulted her family. You can't just steal my tree and act like nothing happened. That's my timber you're unloading. I blinked twice, certain I'd misheard her. She was claiming ownership of wood I'd purchased with my own money, transported in my own truck, and was stacking on my own property. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, setting down the board and walking toward the property line with my hands visible and non-threatening. "This lumber came from a supplier in Wisconsin. I have all the receipts and delivery documentation." But Victoria wasn't interested in documentation or reasonable conversation. She was already pulling out her cell phone, and I could hear her dialing. "I'm calling the police right now. You cut down my oak tree sometime last night and thought you could just haul it away like some common thief." The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. But the genuine fury in her eyes told me this wasn't a joke or a misunderstanding. This woman actually believed I'd stolen her property. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived in separate patrol cars, their presence drawing curious stares from other lake residents who were starting their morning routines. Deputy Martinez was the older of the 2, probably in his 50s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd dealt with plenty of neighbor disputes over the years. His partner looked fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself in what he probably thought was a simple property crime. Victoria immediately launched into her story about the theft of her oak tree, gesturing dramatically toward my woodpile and demanding that they arrest me immediately. I waited quietly while she spoke, then calmly produced my purchase receipts, delivery invoices, and even photos I'd taken of the wood selection process at the supplier's yard. The young deputy examined each document carefully, while Deputy Martinez studied the wood pile with the expression of someone who knew the difference between fresh-cut lumber and seasoned boards. "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez said finally, "this documentation appears to be in order. And frankly, this wood doesn't look like it came from around here. Different species entirely." Victoria's face went from red to purple. That's impossible. I know what I saw. He must have forged those papers. The accusation hung in the air for a moment before Deputy Martinez turned to me with a slight shrug. Sir, everything appears to be legal here. I'd suggest you folks work this out neighborly-like. As the deputies walked back to their cars, Victoria stood trembling with rage, staring at my woodpile like it had personally betrayed her. I could see something calculating behind her eyes, something that told me this was far from over. After the police left, I stood among my carefully arranged lumber and tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or a case of mistaken identity. Victoria had looked me straight in the eye and accused me of theft, demanded my arrest, and refused to accept clear evidence that she was wrong. There was something almost pathological about her reaction, something that suggested this behavior wasn't new for her. I picked up one of the oak boards and ran my hand along its smooth surface, feeling the grain that had taken decades to develop. I just wanted to prepare my wood, I muttered to myself. I never expected to start a war, but Vicky really had no idea who she was dealing with, did she? Type A if you think Mark will win. Type B if you think Vicky will win. The harassment started the very next day. I was sitting on my cabin's front porch with my morning coffee when Victoria's lawn service arrived with industrial equipment and began what she called boundary maintenance. 3 workers with chainsaws and brush cutters started clearing vegetation along our shared property line, but they weren't stopping at her side of the boundary. I watched in disbelief as they moved the large granite boulder that had marked the corner of our properties for decades, rolling it a full 6 feet onto my land. When they started installing posts for what looked like a fence extension, I knew I had to act. Hold on there, I called out, walking over with a copy of my property survey in hand. The crew foreman looked uncomfortable when I showed him the official boundary markers, clearly realizing they were working on the wrong side of the line. Ma'am told us to clear to the new stakes, he said apologetically, pointing to bright orange markers Victoria had apparently placed throughout the night. But these don't match your survey at all. I spent 20 minutes explaining the situation to workers who were just trying to do their job, while Victoria watched from her deck with a satisfied smirk. When I finally convinced them to stop work and leave, she disappeared into her house without a word. That evening, I called Tom Rivera, a land surveyor I'd worked with on a cabin renovation project 2 years earlier. Tom was the kind of professional who took boundary disputes seriously, especially when they involved potential encroachment. Mark, I remember your property from the renovation work, he said over the phone. That boulder's been in the same spot since the original survey in 1978. If someone moved it, we've got documentation to prove where it belongs. We arranged to meet the following morning for a complete boundary verification, and I went to bed thinking this would be resolved quickly with professional documentation. I was wrong. When Tom arrived with his equipment the next morning, Victoria came storming out of her house like she'd been waiting for him. "You're trespassing on my property," she screamed at Tom before he'd even set up his transit. "I know my boundaries, and you have no right to be here." Tom, who'd dealt with difficult property owners before, calmly explained that he was conducting a legal survey at my request and had every right to work from established benchmarks. Victoria's response was to threaten him with a lawsuit and demand that he leave immediately. Tom just smiled, made a note on his clipboard, and continued working. What Tom discovered over the next 3 hours changed everything. Not only had Victoria moved the granite boulder, but she'd also relocated 2 other natural boundary markers, an old iron fence post, and a distinctive twin-trunk maple tree that had been growing on the property line for over 40 years. The encroachment wasn't accidental or gradual. It was deliberate and systematic, designed to claim almost half an acre of my land. "Mark," Tom said quietly as he packed up his equipment, "I've seen this before. This isn't random boundary confusion. Someone's done their homework and made calculated moves to steal your property." That's when I decided to do some homework of my own. A few calls to neighbors around the lake revealed a disturbing pattern that made my blood run cold. The elderly couple who lived in the blue cottage mentioned that Victoria had filed noise complaints against them for using their boat motor after 6 p.m., despite no such restriction existing in the Lake Association rules. The young family across the cove had received a cease and desist letter from Victoria's lawyer, claiming their dock extended into her water rights. Most telling was my conversation with Jim, the retired postmaster who'd lived on the lake for 30 years. She's been here 3 months and already caused more problems than we've had in the last decade, he told me. The family who lived in your neighbor's house before her? They sold and moved to Florida after Victoria filed 6 different complaints with the Homeowners Association in 2 months. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of someone who used legal intimidation and boundary disputes as weapons against anyone she considered a threat to her control. Victoria hadn't moved to the lake for peace and quiet. She'd moved here to establish dominance, and my woodpile had somehow triggered her territorial instincts. I started documenting everything, photographing the moved boundary markers, recording conversations with affected neighbors, and researching public records for any previous legal actions involving Victoria Hartwell. What I found was even more disturbing than I'd expected. Court records from her previous county showed 3 separate restraining orders filed by former neighbors, 2 successful lawsuits for harassment, and a pattern of property disputes going back over 5 years. Victoria wasn't just difficult. She was a serial boundary terrorist who used the legal system to systematically drive people away from their homes. The family who'd sold their lake house had been her most recent victims. Forced to relocate after Victoria's constant complaints and legal threats made their lives unbearable. Now she was setting her sights on me, and my woodpile had apparently been the perfect excuse to start her campaign. That night, I made 2 important decisions. First, I installed a comprehensive security camera system around my cabin and wood storage area. If Victoria was planning to escalate her harassment, I wanted video evidence of everything she did. Second, I decided to fight back with the same methodical approach she was using against me. I began documenting her pattern of behavior, not just with me, but with every neighbor she'd targeted. Tom Rivera agreed to testify about the boundary markers if needed, and several lake residents offered to share their own experiences with Victoria's harassment. "I'll testify if you need me to," Tom said as we shook hands. "What she's doing isn't just wrong, it's illegal. Property boundaries exist for a reason, and people like her can't be allowed to redraw them whenever they feel like it." I watched Victoria's house that evening from my porch, noticing how she kept checking her windows, probably wondering what I was planning next. She'd made the mistake of targeting someone who understood the value of patience and careful planning. In my woodworking business, you measure twice and cut once. In this situation, I was going to document everything twice and act once. But when I did act, it would be devastating. But could Mark really stop what was about to happen next? What do you think Vicky will do next? Drop your predictions below. Recoil Stories wants to know your thoughts. Anna Mitchell had a reputation for being the toughest property rights attorney in the Tri-County area, and her office walls were covered with framed victories against HOA overreach and neighbor harassment cases. When I laid out Victoria's pattern of behavior and showed her Tom Rivera's survey documentation, Sarah's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine concern. "Mark, what you're describing isn't just neighbor drama," she said, spreading the boundary maps across her conference table. "This is systematic property theft with a side of psychological warfare. We need to move fast before she escalates further." The cease and desist letter Sarah drafted was a masterpiece of legal precision. It documented every instance of boundary encroachment, cited specific property laws Victoria had violated, and demanded immediate restoration of all moved markers. We included Tom Rivera's survey as evidence, photographs of the encroachment, and testimonials from 3 other lake residents about Victoria's pattern of harassment. "This should get her attention," Sarah said as she sealed the certified mail envelope. "If she's smart, she'll back down and restore your boundaries. If she's not smart, well, we'll be ready for the next phase." Victoria's response came faster than expected, but not through legal channels. Instead of addressing the cease and desist letter, she launched what I can only describe as a social media warfare campaign against me. Within 24 hours of receiving Sarah's letter, posts began appearing on local community message boards claiming I was a dangerous neighbor who had threatened and intimidated her. She posted carefully staged photos of herself looking distressed, alongside dramatic captions about being terrorized by an aggressive man who thinks he can steal my property. The posts were calculated to generate sympathy while painting me as some kind of unstable threat. The campaign worked better than I'd expected. Margaret Pierce, who served as president of our informal Lake Homeowners Association, called an emergency community meeting to address the safety concerns Victoria had raised. As neighbors filed into the community center that Thursday evening, I could see the division Victoria had created. Some people avoided eye contact with me entirely, while others offered supportive nods. Victoria arrived dressed like she was attending a funeral, complete with dark sunglasses and tissues clutched in her hand, ready to play the role of the grieving victim. "We're here because one of our community members feels threatened and unsafe," Margaret began, and I realized Victoria had gotten to her first with her version of events. "Victoria has brought some serious concerns about boundary violations and intimidation tactics, and we need to address this before someone gets hurt." Victoria's performance was Oscar-worthy. She spoke in a quavering voice about being afraid to leave her house and claimed I had stolen her property and then threatened her when she tried to get it back. When she described my woodpile as evidence of theft, several neighbors nodded sympathetically, but then something unexpected happened. Sarah had advised me to stay calm and let Victoria dig her own hole, and that's exactly what she did. When Margaret asked for my response, I simply handed out copies of Tom Rivera's survey and the cease and desist letter to everyone in the room. "These documents speak for themselves," I said quietly. "The wood Victoria claims I stole was purchased legally from a supplier in Wisconsin. The boundaries she claims I violated have been established and documented for over 40 years, and the intimidation she's describing was actually me asking her workers to stop illegally clearing my property." The mood in the room shifted as people read the survey documentation. Margaret's expression changed from concern to confusion as she studied the boundary maps. "Victoria," she said slowly, "according to this survey, you moved established boundary markers onto Mark's property. Is that accurate?" Victoria's composed victim act began to crack under questioning. "That survey is wrong," she snapped, her voice losing its trembling quality. "I know where my property ends, and I don't need some so-called expert to tell me otherwise." That's when I decided to reveal something I'd been keeping to myself. "Since Victoria seems so interested in my woodpile," I said, standing up to address the room, "maybe I should explain what that lumber is actually for." The room went quiet, and I could see Victoria leaning forward despite herself. "This isn't firewood. It's raw material for a special project I've been planning for 7 years. Each piece has been carefully selected and will be handcrafted into furniture for my family." Margaret looked confused, and several neighbors glanced at each other with raised eyebrows. "Furniture? What kind of furniture requires that much wood?" I smiled, knowing I had everyone's attention. "The kind that takes a master craftsman several years to complete, and the kind that's worth significantly more than most people would guess." Victoria's face went pale, and I could see her doing mental calculations. "But if Victoria wants to keep claiming ownership of lumber she's never seen before, purchased with money she never spent, maybe she should explain how she acquired property that was supposedly cut from a tree that's still standing in her yard." The logical impossibility of her claim hit the room like a wave, and several neighbors actually laughed out loud. Margaret stood up, looking embarrassed and slightly angry. "Victoria, I think we need to have a private conversation after this meeting," she said firmly. "Mark, I apologize for the confusion tonight. It seems there may have been some misunderstandings about the situation." As people filed out of the community center, several neighbors approached me with apologies and offers of support. Victoria sat alone at the front of the room, staring at my woodpile documentation like it contained some terrible secret she'd just discovered. That night, I received a text message from Margaret. "I think I may have misjudged the situation with Victoria. Some of the other neighbors have shared stories that are concerning. We should talk." The tide was turning, but I knew Victoria wouldn't give up easily. Someone with her pattern of behavior doesn't back down just because they've been exposed. If anything, being cornered would make her more dangerous. But when desperate people feel trapped, what exactly will they do next? Type timber if you think Mark is hiding something about that woodpile. Judge Robert Harrison had presided over property disputes for over 20 years, and his no-nonsense courtroom demeanor was legendary among local attorneys. When our case finally reached his docket 3 weeks later, I felt confident that a professional legal setting would expose Victoria's claims for what they really were: a coordinated harassment campaign based on fabricated property rights. Sarah had prepared our case meticulously, with Tom Rivera's survey, photographic evidence, and witness statements from multiple lake residents who could testify about Victoria's pattern of behavior. Victoria arrived at the courthouse with her own attorney, a nervous-looking man named David Lee who kept glancing at his client like he wasn't entirely sure what he'd gotten himself into. She dressed conservatively for court, but her demeanor was anything but subdued. Even before the proceedings began, she was gesturing aggressively toward me and whispering urgently to her lawyer. When Judge Harrison called the court to order, Victoria immediately tried to interrupt him with objections about biased proceedings and demands for emergency restraining orders. "Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Harrison said firmly, "you'll have your opportunity to present your case. Until then, please remain quiet." Sarah began our presentation with Tom Rivera's testimony about the boundary encroachment. Tom was professional and thorough, explaining how established property markers had been deliberately moved and providing GPS coordinates that proved the encroachment. When Victoria's attorney tried to challenge Tom's credentials, Judge Harrison cut him off. "Mr. Rivera is a licensed surveyor with 15 years of experience. His testimony will stand." Then came Victoria's turn to present her case, and that's when things got truly bizarre. Instead of professional documentation or expert testimony, Victoria produced what appeared to be a hand-drawn map, sketched on the back of a pizza box cardboard. "This shows the real property boundaries," she announced, holding up her crude drawing like it was a legal document. That surveyor was obviously paid off by the defendant to produce false maps. Judge Harrison stared at the cardboard map for a long moment before asking, "Mrs. Hartwell, did you just present a hand-drawn sketch on cardboard as evidence in my courtroom?" Victoria's response was to become increasingly agitated, demanding that the judge accept her documentation and immediately order my arrest for theft. "Your Honor, this is clearly a conspiracy between the defendant and his hired surveyor to steal my property. That pile of wood came from my tree, and I demand justice." Judge Harrison's patience was wearing thin, but he allowed her to continue. That's when Victoria made the mistake that would haunt her for the rest of this case. "I don't care if he has some fake receipts," she screamed, pointing directly at me. "That's just a pile of firewood anyway. Who cares about a bunch of logs?" The courtroom went silent. Sarah looked at me with raised eyebrows, and I knew this was the moment we'd been waiting for. I stood up slowly, with Judge Harrison's permission, and walked to the evidence table, where several pieces of my lumber were displayed. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "Mrs. Hartwell just made a very interesting statement about the value of this wood." I picked up one of the oak boards, turning it so the grain caught the courtroom's fluorescent lighting. "This pile of firewood, as she calls it, is actually worth more than the house she's living in." The gasps from the gallery were audible. Victoria's face went from red to white in seconds. "That's impossible," she shouted. "You're lying. It's just wood." But Sarah was already approaching the bench with a folder full of documentation I hadn't mentioned before. "Your Honor, my client has been collecting these materials for a very specific project over the past 7 years. Each piece has been professionally appraised and documented." She handed Judge Harrison the folder, and his eyebrows rose as he flipped through the pages. "Mrs. Hartwell," Judge Harrison said, looking directly at Victoria, "are you aware that the firewood you're claiming ownership of has been appraised at over $300,000? The number hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Victoria's lawyer actually dropped his pen, and several spectators audibly gasped. Margaret Pierce, who had come to observe the proceedings, covered her mouth with her hand. Victoria herself looked like she'd been slapped. "300,000? Victoria whispered, staring at my lumber display with new eyes. "For wood?" Her entire demeanor shifted in that moment, from righteous indignation to something much more calculating and dangerous. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she reassessed everything she thought she knew about my property and my project. This wasn't just about boundaries anymore. This was about serious money. Judge Harrison continued reviewing the appraisal documents, while Victoria's lawyer frantically whispered in her ear. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said finally, "this documentation appears to be legitimate. These are indeed valuable materials, not simple firewood." He turned to Victoria with an expression that suggested his patience was completely exhausted. "Mrs. Hartwell, you've presented no credible evidence of ownership. Your boundary claims have been debunked by a licensed surveyor, and you've just admitted in open court that you thought this property was worthless firewood. Do you have any legitimate legal basis for your claims? Victoria's response was to accuse me of hiding assets and defrauding the court with fake appraisals. She demanded that the judge order a real investigation into how I'd acquired such valuable materials, suggesting that no honest person could afford such an investment. Her lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable as his client spiraled further into conspiracy theories and personal attacks. Judge Harrison finally called a recess, but not before warning Victoria that continued disruption would result in contempt charges. During the break, I watched Victoria pacing outside the courtroom, frantically making phone calls and gesturing wildly. The look in her eyes had changed from mere anger to something much more desperate and dangerous. She'd thought she was fighting over a pile of logs, but now she knew she was dealing with a significant fortune. When someone like Victoria discovers that level of value in something she can't control, history suggests she won't just walk away quietly. That evening, she sat in her car outside my cabin for over an hour, just staring at my lumber pile with those calculating eyes. I had a feeling she was planning something that would make her previous harassment look like child's play. Is there something more about that woodpile that Mark hasn't revealed yet? The truth about that timber is coming. Tell Recoil Stories what you think Mark is hiding. The attack came at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday night, and my security cameras captured every devastating second. Victoria had planned this carefully, waiting until the lake community was fast asleep, and the autumn fog provided natural cover for her approach. She moved like someone who'd done this before, carrying a heavy axe and wearing dark clothing that would make identification difficult if not for the high-definition night vision cameras I'd installed around my property. What she didn't realize was that my security system included motion sensors that sent alerts directly to my phone, waking me the moment she stepped onto my land. I watched from my bedroom window, in horrified fascination, as Victoria approached my carefully stacked lumber with the systematic determination of someone destroying evidence. She wasn't acting in blind rage. This was calculated vandalism designed to eliminate what she now knew was a massive financial asset. Her first swing split a piece of premium walnut that had taken me 6 months to source from a specialty dealer in Oregon. The second swing destroyed a section of maple burl that was literally irreplaceable. Each impact of the axe was like a physical blow to my chest, watching years of careful selection and financial investment being destroyed by someone who couldn't stand the thought of me possessing something valuable she couldn't control. But Victoria wasn't satisfied with just destroying my lumber collection. After 20 minutes of systematic destruction, she turned her attention to my cabin itself, using the axe handle to smash the front window and door frame. The sound of breaking glass echoed across the still lake, and I knew other residents would be calling the police soon. That's when she made her way inside and found my grandmother's antique wooden clock sitting on the mantelpiece, a family heirloom that had been handcrafted by my great-grandfather in 1923. The crash as it hit the floor and splintered into pieces was the sound that finally broke my self-control. I found myself standing in my front yard in bare feet and pajamas, watching Victoria emerge from my cabin with splinters of my grandmother's clock still clinging to the axe blade. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A white-hot fury that made my hands shake and my vision tunnel. That was the last thing my grandmother left me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Victoria just smiled, actually smiled, as she looked at the destruction she'd caused. Maybe next time you'll think twice about stealing other people's property, she said, dropping the axe and walking calmly back toward her house like she'd just finished some routine yard work. I don't remember picking up the axe. I don't remember taking the first step toward Victoria's retreating figure. What I do remember is Anna Mitchell's voice cutting through my rage like a blade, calling my name from the driveway where she'd arrived after receiving my emergency text message. Mark. Stop. Don't you dare touch that axe. Her words hit me like cold water, and I realized I was standing 10 feet from Victoria with my grandmother's blood-stained axe in my hands. If Sarah hadn't arrived when she did, I might have done something that would have destroyed my life just as thoroughly as Victoria had destroyed my property. Put the axe down, Mark, Sarah said gently, approaching me like I was a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. I know you're angry. I know this feels impossible to bear. But if you swing that axe at her, she wins. Everything we've fought for, everything your grandfather built, everything your grandmother left you, she wins it all if you make this choice. I looked at Victoria, who was now standing on her porch with her phone out, clearly hoping I'd attack her so she could claim self-defense. The calculation in her eyes was obvious. She'd destroyed my property specifically to provoke me into doing something that would make me the criminal instead of her. I dropped the axe and sank to my knees among the scattered remains of my lumber collection. Some pieces were completely destroyed, split into unusable fragments that would be good for nothing but kindling. Others were damaged but might be salvageable with careful repair work. But as I began examining the destruction more closely, the true scope of Victoria's attack became clear. She hadn't just randomly destroyed wood. She'd specifically targeted the rarest and most valuable pieces in my collection. The 200-year-old chestnut beam that had cost me $12,000 was split down the middle. The figured maple that had been destined for a dining room table was reduced to splinters. In total, she'd destroyed over $300,000 worth of irreplaceable materials. "Mark," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside me in the wreckage, "do you have security cameras that captured this?" I nodded numbly, still trying to process the magnitude of what had been lost. Good, because what she just did wasn't simple vandalism. It was felony destruction of property worth more than most people's houses. "She's going to prison for this." As if summoned by Sarah's words, I heard sirens approaching from the main road. The police response was faster than I'd expected, probably because multiple neighbors had called in reports of someone screaming and the sound of breaking glass. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of police reports, evidence collection, and witness statements. My security footage was crystal clear, showing Victoria's entire attack from multiple angles. The DNA evidence she'd left behind was even more damning. Blood from a cut on her hand, fabric from her jacket caught on my cabin's broken window frame, and even strands of her distinctively colored hair embedded in the axe blade. When Detective Morrison finished reviewing the footage, he looked at Victoria with the expression of someone who'd just watched a confession video. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for felony destruction of property, criminal trespass, and breaking and entering." Victoria's arrest was almost anticlimactic after the chaos of her attack. She didn't resist or protest her innocence. Instead, she seemed strangely calm as the handcuffs were applied, like she'd accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. "You have no idea what you've lost," she said to me as she was led toward the patrol car. "That wood was worth more than you'll ever know." Her words sent a chill down my spine, not because of any threat they contained, but because of what they revealed. Victoria knew something about my lumber collection that she shouldn't have known, something that suggested this attack was more calculated than simple revenge. As the police cars disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness and the lake community slowly returned to sleep, I stood among the ruins of 7 years' worth of careful collecting and planning. Sarah helped me document the damage for insurance purposes, but we both knew that some of these pieces could never be replaced. The project I'd been planning, the furniture set that was supposed to honor my family's woodworking tradition, was effectively destroyed. But as the sun began to rise over the lake, painting the scattered wood fragments in golden light, I realized something that would change everything. Victoria's attack had revealed something about my lumber that I'd never told anyone, something that would make her destruction of it far more devastating than she could have possibly imagined. But was the real story about that woodpile exactly what Mark thought it was? Type shock, if you never expected what's about to be revealed. The courtroom was packed for Victoria's arraignment 3 days later, with local news crews stationed outside and curious lake residents filling every available seat. Word had spread quickly about the $300,000 timber destruction, and everyone wanted to see how this bizarre neighbor dispute would finally resolve. Victoria sat at the defendant's table, looking defiant despite being charged with multiple felonies, occasionally glancing at me with that same calculating expression she'd worn since learning about my lumber's value. Her lawyer, David Lee, looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in the past week, probably realizing his client had just committed one of the most expensive acts of vandalism in county history. Judge Harrison entered with an expression that suggested he'd already reviewed the case files and wasn't impressed with what he'd found. "We're here for the arraignment of Victoria Hartwell on charges of felony destruction of property, criminal trespass, and breaking and entering," he announced. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're accused of destroying timber and personal property valued at over $300,000. How do you plead?" Victoria stood slowly, and for a moment, I thought she might actually show some remorse or acknowledgement of the severity of her situation. Instead, she looked directly at Judge Harrison and said, "Not guilty, Your Honor, and I demand a full investigation into how that man acquired stolen property." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief. Even after being caught on video committing felony vandalism, Victoria was still claiming that I was somehow the criminal in this situation. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order, but Victoria wasn't finished. "Your Honor, no honest person spends that kind of money on firewood. That timber was obviously stolen, and I was just trying to prevent a crime." Her lawyer tugged at her arm, clearly trying to get her to stop talking, but Victoria shook him off. "I demand you investigate where that wood really came from." Victoria's lawyer vigorously denied the evidence, claiming the footage was manipulated and demanding proof of the timber's actual value. "Your Honor, my client maintains her innocence. We contend that Mr. Thompson has fabricated these appraisals to inflate the charges against Mrs. Hartwell." The desperation in his voice was obvious as he tried to mount any defense for his unstable client. "We request a thorough investigation into the supposed value of this ordinary firewood." Sarah stood up at our table, and I could see the slight smile on her face that meant she was about to deploy a legal weapon Victoria had no idea was coming. "Your Honor, the defendant seems very interested in the provenance of my client's timber collection. Perhaps this would be an appropriate time to provide a complete accounting of how these materials were acquired and their true value." Judge Harrison nodded, and Sarah walked to the evidence table where several pieces of my lumber were displayed as exhibits. "Mr. Thompson, would you please explain to the court exactly what this timber represents?" I stood up, feeling every eye in the courtroom focused on me, and walked to the evidence table. Victoria was leaning forward in her chair, and I could see the mixture of curiosity and dread in her expression. She'd been so focused on proving I was a criminal that she'd never considered there might be more to this story than she understood. "Your Honor, Mrs. Hartwell is correct that this isn't ordinary firewood. But what she doesn't understand is exactly what makes it so valuable." I picked up a piece of the destroyed walnut, turning it so the intricate grain pattern caught the courtroom lighting. "This is part of a rare wood collection that I've been building for 7 years. I continued, reaching into the evidence box for the folder of documentation Sarah had prepared. "But it's more than just rare wood. Each piece in this collection was specifically chosen and purchased for a single project, a complete furniture set that would recreate pieces my great-grandfather built in the 1920s. The courtroom was completely silent now, with even Judge Harrison leaning forward to hear every word. My great-grandfather, Thomas Thompson, was a master craftsman who built furniture for wealthy families across the Midwest. His pieces are now worth tens of thousands of dollars each and are displayed in museums." Victoria's face had gone pale, but I wasn't finished. Sarah handed me a leather portfolio containing photographs and documentation that would change everything everyone thought they knew about this case. "Your Honor, we have appraisals from 3 different experts confirming not just the material value, but the historical significance of this project," Sarah said, approaching the bench with additional documentation. "The total value of what Mrs. Hartwell destroyed, including the lost historical recreation project, exceeds $2.3 million. The number hit the courtroom like a physical blow. $2.3 million. Victoria made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a moan, finally understanding the true magnitude of what she'd done. Judge Harrison was reading through the expert appraisals with increasing disbelief, occasionally looking up at me like he was trying to confirm this wasn't some elaborate hoax. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said finally, "do you understand that you've just been charged with destroying what amounts to a historical art project worth more than most people will earn in their entire lifetimes?" Victoria tried to speak several times before any words came out. I didn't know. It was just wood." Her voice trailed off as the reality of her situation sank in. This wasn't a simple neighbor dispute anymore. This was a case that would likely be studied in law schools for decades to come. The woman who had claimed I'd stolen her firewood had just destroyed one of the most ambitious historical recreation projects ever attempted by a private individual. But the final twist was yet to come. Sarah approached the evidence table and picked up one of the surviving pieces of lumber, turning it to reveal something I'd never mentioned in any of our previous proceedings. Carved into the wood, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was a small letter M surrounded by a decorative border. "Your Honor, "There's one more thing the court should know about Mr. Thompson's rare wood collection," Sarah said, holding the piece so everyone could see the marking. Every single piece was personally marked with Mr. Thompson's signature stamp, a technique he learned from his great-grandfather. The courtroom gasped as Sarah continued. "These marks prove beyond any doubt that this lumber belongs to Mr. Thompson and was prepared specifically for his historical recreation project. This is my timber, the life's work Mr. Thompson accumulated over 7 years. Victoria destroyed the very thing she claimed was her timber, and now everyone knows exactly who this timber really belonged to." The irony was devastating and perfect. Victoria had spent months claiming ownership of property that literally had my signature carved into every piece. Victoria's complete collapse was visible to everyone in the courtroom. The woman who had spent months claiming ownership of my property was now face to face with evidence that I had literally signed my name to every piece of wood she'd destroyed. Judge Harrison looked at the marked lumber, then at Victoria, then back at the lumber with an expression that suggested he was still trying to process the scope of this case. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, "you've destroyed a $2 million historical art project, and then spent months claiming you owned the materials used to create it." Victoria's only response was to faint, slumping forward in her chair as the full weight of her legal and financial situation finally hit her. As paramedics were called and the courtroom erupted in chaos, I stood quietly among the evidence of my great-grandfather's legacy, knowing that justice was finally being served. The woman who had screamed, "Her timber," had just learned the devastating truth about whose timber it really was. Margaret Pierce stood up in the gallery, tears streaming down her face as she said, "I'm so sorry, Mark. I should have listened to you from the beginning." The community support was overwhelming as neighbors approached to apologize and offer help with rebuilding what Victoria had destroyed. But was this really the complete truth about Victoria's past behavior? The final revelations will shock you. Recoil Stories has one more twist coming. Victoria's sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, after a plea negotiation that resulted in her accepting full responsibility for the destruction of my historical timber project. The courtroom was again packed, but this time the atmosphere was different, more somber, less sensational. Victoria had spent those 6 weeks in county jail, unable to make the $500,000 bail Judge Harrison had set, and the experience had clearly taken its toll. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of what her harassment campaign had ultimately cost her. Judge Harrison had reviewed extensive documentation about the case during the intervening weeks, including psychological evaluations that painted a disturbing picture of Victoria's mental state and behavioral patterns. "Mrs. Hartwell," he began, "I've presided over property disputes for over 20 years, but I've never encountered a case quite like this one. The destruction you caused wasn't just financially devastating. It represented the elimination of a family legacy that took 7 years to assemble and can never be fully restored." Victoria sat silently as he spoke, no longer the defiant, aggressive woman who had first accused me of theft. The financial consequences alone were staggering. Victoria was ordered to pay full restitution of $2.3 million, an amount that would require her to liquidate virtually every asset she owned, including the lakefront mansion that had started this entire conflict. Her insurance company had already denied coverage, citing the intentional nature of the destruction, leaving her personally liable for the full amount. "Mrs. Hartwell will serve 18 months in state prison," Judge Harrison announced, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. "She is also permanently prohibited from initiating any legal action against Mr. Thompson or his property." But the courtroom drama was just the beginning of Victoria's consequences. Margaret Pierce had organized an emergency homeowners association meeting the week after Victoria's arrest, and the Lake community's response was swift and decisive. "What Victoria did doesn't just affect Mark," Margaret told the assembled residents. "It affects all of our property values and the reputation of our entire community. We need to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." The association voted unanimously to revise their conflict resolution procedures and implement background checks for new residents, a direct response to what they'd learned about Victoria's history. That history was more extensive than anyone had imagined. 3 days after Victoria's sentencing, I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox containing documents that revealed the true scope of her destructive behavior. Police reports from 4 different states, showed a pattern of neighbor harassment going back over 15 years. Court documents detailed restraining orders, harassment charges, and property disputes that had forced multiple families to relocate just to escape Victoria's campaigns of intimidation. The woman who had moved to our peaceful lake community wasn't seeking quiet retirement. She was continuing a decades-long pattern of destroying other people's lives for sport. The most disturbing revelation was a series of newspaper articles from Victoria's previous locations, documenting cases where her harassment had driven elderly residents from their homes and caused at least 2 stress-related hospitalizations. In one particularly heartbreaking case, an 80-year-old widower had suffered a heart attack after Victoria filed 17 different complaints against him in a single month, claiming violations of homeowner association rules that didn't actually exist. The man survived, but was forced to sell his home of 40 years and move in with relatives in another state. Margaret Pierce broke down in tears when I showed her the documentation. "Mark, I am so sorry," she said, sitting in my partially rebuilt cabin a week after the sentencing. "If I had known what kind of person Victoria was, I never would have supported her for even a minute. The fact that she nearly succeeded in driving you away too." Her voice trailed off as she looked at the space where my timber collection had been stored. The insurance settlement would allow me to purchase replacement materials, but the 7 years of research and the irreplaceable pieces like the 200-year-old chestnut would be lost forever. The lake community's support during my recovery was overwhelming. Neighbors who had initially believed Victoria's lies now went out of their way to help with cabin repairs and offer assistance with my woodworking projects. Tom Rivera donated his services to establish permanent boundary markers that would prevent any future encroachment disputes. Even more meaningful was the collection that several residents organized to help fund the replacement of my most expensive pieces. "It's not about the money," explained Jim, the retired postmaster who organized the effort. "It's about making sure Victoria's evil doesn't win." 3 months after Victoria's incarceration, her lakefront mansion went up for sale at a price 40% below its assessed value. The real estate agent admitted privately that the house's association with the timber destruction case had made it difficult to find buyers, especially among families who might have young children. Victoria's husband had filed for divorce 2 weeks into her jail sentence, citing irreconcilable differences and financial ruin as grounds for separation. The man who had once seemed devoted to his wife couldn't handle the embarrassment and financial devastation her behavior had caused. As autumn turned to winter, I found myself back in my workshop, carefully crafting the first pieces of my great-grandfather's recreated furniture collection. The replacement timber wasn't identical to what Victoria had destroyed, but it was close enough to honor the original design intent. More importantly, the project now carries additional meaning as a symbol of resilience and community support. Margaret Pierce commissioned me to build a memorial bench for the Lake Community Center, incorporating some of the salvaged pieces from Victoria's attack as a reminder that destructive behavior ultimately fails when communities stand together. The final chapter of Victoria's story came in the form of a brief newspaper article 6 months later. She had been released from prison after serving her full sentence and had relocated to a small town in Nevada, where she was reportedly living in a trailer park and working at a convenience store to pay off her restitution debt. The woman who had once owned a $1 million lakefront mansion was now earning minimum wage, her destructive behavior having finally caught up with her in the most comprehensive way possible. On quiet evenings, I sit on my cabin porch and watch the sunset reflect off the lake's surface, surrounded by the slowly growing collection of furniture pieces that will someday complete my great-grandfather's legacy. The My Timber, My Cabin, My Rules sign that the Homeowners Association unanimously approved stands as a permanent reminder that property rights matter, that communities can overcome destructive individuals, and that sometimes justice takes time but always arrives eventually. My phone rang last week with a call from Anna Mitchell. "Mark, I've got another timber dispute case. This one involving a family in Colorado, whose neighbor is claiming ownership of their antique barnwood collection. Are you interested in consulting on the case?" I looked at my sign, smiled, and said, "Timber disputes. There's always another one." If this story shocked you as much as it shocked me to live through it, smash that like button. It really helps more people discover these crazy neighbor stories. And if you want to support more content like this, there's a donation link in the description. Every little bit helps me keep bringing you these wild tales of justice served. Thanks for watching. and I'll see you in the next video, where we dive into another unbelievable neighbor war. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when an HOA president tries to ban someone's service dog. Until next time.